everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of the BitCast, also known as the Back in Time podcast. In today's episode 1, want to introduce myself and the show, tell you how this podcast is going to work, and then move on to the real topic of today's episode, the American Civil War. Without further delay, let's get this show on the road. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Barley and I am a brawler in the famous game from Supercell, Brawl Stars. I know it's a lot to take in, so I'll give you guys some time. Anyways, I wish I could have the podcast in iTunes or somewhere you can listen to this as the background, but for now this is going to be a YouTube podcast and maybe soon a SoundCloud podcast, who knows. This isn't a full-out history podcast, this is more on the fun and interesting side of history. Each episode 1 will pull out an event throughout history and talk about it on the show. I try to choose events that are interesting and are discussion worthy. Some of them might be controversial, like this one, but let's be honest, most people don't care about that. Furthermore, the topic won't always be history related. Sometimes it will be a game, book, or a movie. Who knows, the possibilities are endless. I will usually be the only one in the show, but I am hoping to get some people in some episodes. It would be fun to have a second opinion for the discussions. Another thing I want to make clear is that I am nowhere close to being a historian, so sometimes I might get some stuff wrong. It's just that I am a writer, and so I think as a writer, and when I learn history, I think about it as a huge story. At first, when planning the show, I thought I could make it into a huge story. And how do you start a story? From the beginning, but then I decided to try something different. The stories I tell you are not in order, but they might interfere with each other, so just keep that in mind. You know, this reminds me of one of my favorite shows, Legends of Tomorrow. You know, how they are time travelers. Well, that's what we are, sort of. We will jump back in time and live history. Now, this is how the storytelling is going to work. I want to make the events to sound like a story. So I might exaggerate on some parts and might exclude some, might add some stuff and might change some, but I will try to keep it as real as possible. And so, let's move on to the main topic of today's episode, the American Civil War. The Civil War is the deadliest war that has ever occurred in America, resulting in 620,000 American soldiers dead. That's more than the number of Americans who died on World War II. This war tore families apart. Brothers disagreed and joined opposing sides, and some ended up killing each other. Friends hated each other, and you could trust no one. Ever heard of that saying, united we stand, divided we fall? Well, that comes from the Civil War, and I am not talking about the Captain America movie, although that film was epic. Before we go over the war itself, let's begin with the pre-war. I know this goes without saying, but the war didn't start overnight. The Civil War was years in the making. There are many causes that led to the American Civil War. While slavery is generally cited as the main cause for the war, other political and cultural differences between the North and the South certainly contributed. In the mid-1800s, the economies of many northern states had moved away from farming to industry. A lot of people in the North worked and lived in large cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. The southern states, however, had maintained a large farming economy, and this economy was based on slave labor. While the North no longer needed slaves, the South relied heavily upon slaves for their way of life. States' rights. The idea of states' rights was not new to the Civil War. Since the Constitution was first written, there had been arguments about how much power the states should have versus how much power the federal government should have. The southern states felt that the federal government was taking away their rights and powers. Furthermore, as the United States continued to expand westward, each new state added to the country shifted the power between the North and the South. Southern states began to fear they would lose so much power that they would lose all their rights. Each new state became a battleground between the two sides for power. At the heart of much of the South's issues was slavery. The South relied on slavery for labor to work the fields. Many people in the North believed that slavery was wrong and evil. These people were called abolitionists. They wanted slavery made illegal throughout the United States. Abolitionists such as John Brown, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Harriet Beecher Stowe began to convince more and more people of the evil of slavery. This made the South fearful that their way of life would come to an end. Another event that led to the war was a skirmish known as Bleeding Kansas. This was the first fighting over the slavery issue took place in Kansas. In 1854, the government passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowing the residents of Kansas to vote on whether they would be a slave state or a free state. The region was flooded with supporters from both sides. They fought over the issue for years. Several people were killed in small skirmishes, giving the confrontation the name Bleeding Kansas. Eventually Kansas entered the Union as a free state in 1861. But the main reason, the final straw for the South, the event that broke the camel's neck, was election of Abraham Lincoln to President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was a member of the new anti-slavery Republican Party. He managed to get elected without even being on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. The southern states felt that Lincoln was against slavery and also against the South. When Lincoln was elected, many of the southern states decided they no longer wanted to be a part of the United States. They felt that they had every right to leave. Starting with South Carolina, 11 states would eventually leave the United States and form a new country called the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln said they did not have the right to leave the United States and sent in troops to stop the South from leaving. And with that, the Civil War began.
It was South versus the North. The Confederacy against the Union. Now, here's another quick summary of the Civil War. The American Civil War, 1861-1865, resulted from long-standing sectional differences and questions not fully resolved when the United States Constitution was ratified in 1789, primarily the issue of slavery and states' rights. With the defeat of the Southern Confederacy and the subsequent passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Civil War's lasting effects include abolishing the institution of slavery in America and firmly redefining the United States as a single, indivisible nation rather than a loosely bound collection of independent states.
On April 10, 1861, knowing that resupplies were on their way from the north to the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, provisional Confederate forces in the city demanded the fort surrender. The fort's commander, Major Robert Anderson, refused. On April 12, the Confederates opened fire with cannon. At 2:30 p.m. the following day, Major Anderson surrendered. On April 15, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the Southern Rebellion, a move that prompted Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina to reverse themselves and vote in favor of secession. Most of the western section of Virginia rejected the secession vote and broke away, ultimately forming a new, Union-loyal state, West Virginia. The United States had always maintained only a small professional army. The nation's founders had feared a Napoleon-esque leader might rise up and use a large army to overthrow the government and make himself a dictator. Many graduates of the U.S. Army's military academy, West Point, resigned their commissions in order to fight for the South. This was especially true in the cavalry arm, but no members of the artillery went south. The Lincoln administration had to rely on large numbers of volunteers from the states and territories. In Richmond, Virginia, the president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, faced a similar problem in raising and equipping armies. Neither side expected a war of long duration. The funny thing is, everyone thought the war would be over in one fight. Volunteers were asked to serve for 90 days. Southerners thought Northerners too weak and cowardly to fight. Northerners thought a dependence upon slave labor had rendered Southerners too weak both physically and morally to present a serious battlefield threat. They had no idea what awaited 4 years of war, until finally General Lee surrendered and the war was over. And so was Lincoln's life. Now before we go into that, here's the thing about Lee. He was the commander of the Confederacy, but he only agreed to because his home state, Virginia, chose to join the Confederacy. Lee was one of the best commanders at the time. He was so good that Lincoln wanted for him to join the Union. That wasn't the case. The Union went through quite a lot of commanders, but they were never good enough. Anytime the Union won, the South would retreat. That gave the Union a chance to go finish them off, but the commanders were too scared to do so. Everyone but Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was the last commander of the Union. He wasn't scared of finishing Lee off. And so, Lee surrendered at the Appomattox courthouse. You would think that was the end, right? Well, there was this guy. A guy named John Wilkes Booth. He went to Ford's Theater one day, to pay a visit to one of the spectators. That spectator was President Lincoln and Booth pulled the trigger. Lincoln was dead. Booth's reasoning was that he was doing the South a favor by getting rid of the Union's leader. Little did he know, the Civil War had come to an end. There was one more battle after the end of the war. It was the Battle of Palmetto Ranch, but I won't go into detail. To finish the story, let me tell you what happened next. The Union was preserved and Ulysses S. Grant became president. The Civil War was over, many died, and many were broken. A new era began, the Reconstruction. That was a messy era, but with time things would get a lot better. Not perfect, but way better. For all people, both genders, and all races. And thus ends today's episode. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe for more content. New episodes will be released once a week or so, but keep in mind they take a lot of planning and editing and a lot of research is made. Visual don't have any social media, but I actually helped my best bud, Chief Lumber, aka Nor. I helped him make the podcast. He came up with the idea and made the outline, so if you want to follow him on social media, you can do so. His Twitter is at FSS_YT and his Instagram is Chief_Lumber. Other than that, I shall see you in the next episode of the BitCast.